When I first met Lisa, I thought I'd hit the lottery. She had this way about her, a fire that drew people in but could burn you if you weren't careful. Sharp-witted, adventurous, and funny as hell, she was the kind of woman who could make a simple walk to the store feel like an adventure. I'd been in a few relationships, but nothing ever felt as consuming as what I had with Lisa. She wasn't just my girlfriend, she became my best friend, the one person who could balance out my intensity with her calm and light-hearted nature. So, naturally, when I proposed after 3 years together, I had zero doubts. Marriage was a no-brainer. I was convinced we were going to build a rock-solid life together. We settled into married life like clockwork. We had our little routines, our shared hobbies, and our inside jokes. Life was good, great even. My parents adored her too. Mom always said Lisa brought out the best in me, and Dad, well, he was a bit more complicated. He's always been the kind of guy who's a little too comfortable making off-color jokes. Growing up, he was the cool dad, the one who'd slip you a beer before you were old enough to drink and tell you to keep it a secret from your mom. Even at family gatherings, he had this habit of pushing boundaries, saying things that made people chuckle awkwardly. Most of the time, it was harmless, and Lisa always laughed it off. I figured she was just good-natured about his quirks. One evening, about 3 years into our marriage, we were having dinner with my parents at our place. It was a relaxed night. Lisa had cooked one of her famous lasagnas, and the wine was flowing freely. We'd reached that comfortable stage in the night where everyone's had just enough to drink, and the conversation's drifting into slightly more personal territory. My dad was recounting some wild stories from his younger days, and then he hit us with a zinger. "Hey," he said, leaning back with a mischievous grin. "Why don't we all try a little love in threes, huh?" He waggled his eyebrows, clearly enjoying his own joke. My mom rolled her eyes, muttering something under her breath, but Lisa? She didn't just laugh, she threw her head back and laughed loud, maybe a little too loud. She looked at him with a gleam in her eye and shot back. "Maybe we should keep things interesting." She glanced my way, but her gaze lingered on my dad just a moment longer than it should have. "It was just a joke, right?" My dad had always been the king of inappropriate humor, and Lisa was playing along like she usually did. But something about her response made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I brushed it off that night, chalking it up to the wine, the atmosphere, the usual back-and-forth banter that went on whenever my dad was around. But the look they'd shared, the ease between them, it stuck with me. Over the next few weeks, I noticed subtle things I couldn't quite explain. My parents' house had some plumbing issues, so my mom suggested they stay with us for a bit while repairs were done. It wasn't ideal. I mean, who really wants their parents staying with them? But I couldn't exactly say no. I had a big project at work, and I figured I'd barely be home anyway, so what harm could it do? They moved in on a Wednesday, and for the first couple of days, everything seemed normal. Lisa was the perfect hostess, making sure they were comfortable, and my dad was his usual self, teasing her, calling her the chef every time she served a meal, and cracking his usual borderline jokes. But I couldn't help but notice Lisa's reaction to him. She laughed harder than usual, threw in playful jabs, and occasionally, I'd catch her looking at him with an expression I couldn't quite read. One night, we were all in the living room. Dad was sprawled out on the couch, hogging the remote, and Lisa was curled up on the armchair across from him, sipping on a glass of wine. My mom had already gone to bed, and I was flipping through some work emails on my phone, half listening to the two of them joke about something on TV. Then, out of nowhere, Dad made another threesome joke. "So, now that I'm practically living here, should we give that three-way thing a go, son?" he asked, chuckling as he looked between me and Lisa. Without missing a beat, Lisa smirked and said, "Well, maybe we should test it out. See if you can handle it." She winked at him, glancing at me with a playful grin, but the joke had a weird edge to it this time. A flicker of something that made me clench my jaw. I forced a laugh, hoping it sounded genuine. My mind raced with questions I didn't want to ask, doubts I couldn't shake. Lisa wasn't actually serious, right? This was my father we were talking about. But the ease between them, the way she'd started looking at him lately, it was like they were sharing some unspoken language I couldn't understand. And the way she kept making eye contact with him, that too familiar gleam in her eye, it was unsettling. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed, I brought it up. "Lisa," I said, trying to keep my tone casual, "you and my dad have been joking around a lot lately. What's going on there?" She raised an eyebrow, giving me a smirk. "What, you're getting jealous?" she teased, reaching over to poke my chest playfully. "Come on, babe, it's harmless. You know how your dad is. He's just a flirt." "Yeah, but don't you think it's getting a little weird?" I pressed, not letting it go. She rolled her eyes, laughing. "Are you seriously worried about this?" "It's just jokes, babe. I mean, it's not like I'm actually going to, do anything." She said it with a light-hearted laugh, but somehow that didn't settle my nerves. Instead, it made them worse. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I told myself I was being paranoid. Lisa loved me, and my dad was just an old flirt who didn't know when to quit. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, a small, gnawing part of me wouldn't let it go. My parents had only been staying with us for about a week, but already, the atmosphere in the house had changed. I couldn't quite describe it, just a vague sense of tension I couldn't shake off. I told myself it was just the strain of having house guests. But deep down, it felt like something more than that, something I couldn't put my finger on yet. Over the next few days, I started noticing strange little things between Lisa and my dad. I'd walk into a room and find them sitting too close on the couch, her laughing a bit too freely at his crude jokes, him touching her shoulder or patting her knee a little too comfortably. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself I was being paranoid or seeing things that weren't there. After all, my father had always been a bit of a flirt, even with women much younger than him. It was his way of being friendly, and he didn't mean any harm. But seeing it directed at my own wife was starting to get under my skin. Then, one afternoon, I came home early from work. I walked into the living room and found Lisa and my dad huddled together, looking at something on her phone. They were sitting close enough that their heads almost touched. They both looked up with startled expressions when I walked in, and Lisa quickly pulled her phone away, stuffing it into her pocket like she didn't want me to see it. "Hey, what's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light and casual, though I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. "Oh, nothing," Lisa said quickly, laughing a little too loudly. "Your dad was just showing me some funny photos he found online." Dad grinned, but his smile seemed forced. "Yeah, just some old family photos," he added, giving a quick glance at Lisa before looking away. The explanation didn't sit right. My dad was notoriously camera shy. He had a habit of ducking out of photos whenever someone tried to snap one of him. And family photos? Since when did those spark this much laughter? I didn't push it, but something about the way they'd been so engrossed, so involved, left a bad taste in my mouth. A few days later, I started planning a small renovation project I'd been considering for a while, a sauna in the basement. I'd always wanted one, and it seemed like a good distraction. I figured the project would help me focus on something productive instead of overanalyzing every interaction between my wife and my father. I got the work going fast, ordering supplies, setting up the space, and throwing myself into it. Lisa seemed enthusiastic about the idea, saying how relaxing it would be after a long day. One evening, I was down there, working on the sauna, when Dad came in, leaning against the doorway, watching me with a smirk. "This thing's gonna be nice. Never thought I'd get to enjoy a luxury like this under my son's roof," he said with a chuckle. "Yeah, well," I muttered, keeping my eyes on the work in front of me. "I figured it'd be a nice touch for the house." He lingered there for a bit, watching me in that way that made me uneasy. After a while, he said, "Lisa seems excited about it. I heard her say she might be in here all the time once it's done." He laughed in that way that usually meant he was implying something, but I didn't respond. I noticed then how often he mentioned Lisa, whether it was about something she said, or something she did, or how she looked a certain day. Every comment seemed to carry a hidden layer of meaning, and I felt that nagging discomfort growing. But again, I pushed it aside, telling myself I was being paranoid. A couple of weeks later, the sauna was finally ready. It wasn't massive, but it was big enough for a few people to sit comfortably. I was proud of it, and Lisa seemed genuinely thrilled. We planned to have a little sauna night to celebrate. My parents were supposed to go out for dinner that night, so I figured Lisa and I would have the place to ourselves. But as luck would have it, their plans fell through. My mom wasn't feeling well, so they stayed home instead. My mom went to bed early, and Lisa suggested we still go ahead with the sauna. "It's your hard work, babe," she said, smiling at me. "We should enjoy it." I agreed, figuring it might actually be nice to have my dad join us, despite my lingering suspicions. I grabbed us some beers and towels, and we all headed down to the sauna together. It was warm, dimly lit, and smelled like cedar. For the first half hour, everything was normal. We were just three people unwinding, laughing, talking, sipping our beers. I started to relax, convincing myself that everything was in my head. But then my phone buzzed. It was an old friend of mine, Mike, who texted, saying he needed help moving some furniture. He was in a pinch and couldn't find anyone else to lend him a hand. I hesitated, looking at Lisa, who gave me an encouraging smile. "Go help him out," she said. "Your dad and I can finish up here. It's just us." I stood there for a second, glancing between them. "You sure?" I asked. She nodded. "We'll be fine. It's not like your dad's a stranger." She laughed, and Dad joined in, waving me off with a grin. So I grabbed my keys and left, but a strange feeling settled over me as I walked out the door. The whole situation felt off, but I forced myself to focus on the task at hand. When I got back a couple of hours later, I found Lisa in the kitchen, making herself a cup of tea, still in her robe. Her face lit up when she saw me. "Hey! That was quick. We were just finishing up," she said with a bright smile. Dad had already gone up to bed, and everything seemed completely normal. But then, as I was drying off in the bathroom, Lisa came in, a mischievous look in her eye. She wrapped her arms around me and whispered, "So, how about that threesome with your dad?" She laughed, giving me a playful nudge, but something in her tone felt too suggestive, too real. I froze, staring at her. "You're joking, right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She laughed, brushing it off. "Of course. But you should have seen the look on your face." She was still smiling, but that look, something in her eyes, made me uneasy, like she was testing me, trying to gauge my reaction. The days after that joke, the uneasy feeling gnawed at me, stronger than before. Lisa's words, meant as a joke, she said, echoed in my head, but it was her expression that lingered. I told myself I was overthinking things, but doubts kept creeping back in. Could it really be just a misunderstanding? She'd always been a bit too friendly with my dad, but I'd always ignored it, brushing it off as her being polite, a good daughter-in-law. Now, I wasn't so sure. The tension in the house grew every day, but it seemed like I was the only one who felt it. Lisa and my dad carried on with their banter, laughing and joking in a way that set my teeth on edge. And the more I tried to brush off my suspicions, the stronger they got. I couldn't help but watch their every interaction, analyzing every laugh, every glance, every lingering look. The feeling that something was wrong was too strong to ignore now. But I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I needed proof, something solid that could either confirm my fears or put them to rest once and for all. I decided to test Lisa, to see how far she would go. I noticed she and my dad had a habit of lingering around the kitchen whenever I wasn't there, talking in low voices and exchanging glances that were anything but innocent. So I devised a little setup. I'd invite her to join me in the shower, leave for a fake errand, and see if she'd take the bait. The day of the test arrived. I casually suggested we shower together, as we sometimes did. Lisa agreed, laughing and leaning into me with that playful energy she used to have back when we first met. But as the water poured down, I felt distant, my mind racing with the setup. Right on cue, my phone buzzed with a call I'd prearranged with my friend Mike. I took a quick breath and looked at Lisa, pretending to look surprised. Mike needs a hand, I said, turning to leave. I'll be back soon. She seemed a little disappointed but shrugged it off, saying, I'll keep showering. I'll see you when you get back. I got dressed quickly and slipped out of the house, but I didn't go far. I parked around the corner, pulling up the live feed from the small camera I'd hidden in the shower, feeling half sick from what I was doing. A part of me was desperate to be wrong, to catch her doing nothing but finishing her shower alone. But as I watched, my worst suspicions unfolded right before my eyes. No sooner had I closed the door than Lisa shut off the water, wrapped herself in a towel, and disappeared from the frame. Minutes later, I saw my father appear, glancing around before stepping into the bathroom. They exchanged hushed words, and then he reached out, touching her shoulder in a way that erased all doubts I'd been clinging to. She leaned into him, not resisting, her head tilted up toward his in a way that made my blood boil. I sat there in the car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, watching this twisted scene unfold in a detached daze. Anger, betrayal, disgust, they all surged through me, but I couldn't bring myself to burst through that door and confront them right then and there. No, this was deeper than anger. I wasn't going to let them get off that easily. I wanted revenge, and I wanted it to be something they would never forget. I spent the next few days pretending like nothing was wrong, though every time I looked at Lisa or my father, I felt a deep, simmering rage. They thought they'd gotten away with it, that I had no idea. But I had a plan forming, a way to give them a taste of the shame and betrayal they'd handed to me. That weekend I suggested we use the sauna again, as a way to relax, after a long week. I even suggested my dad join us, acting as if I didn't have a care in the world. Lisa seemed thrilled, and I could see my dad trying to hide his smirk, as if he'd somehow bested me. I kept my face neutral, not letting on that I knew everything. This would be the night they learned exactly who they were dealing with. We gathered everything, towels, drinks, the usual, and headed down to the sauna. Just before stepping in, I pretended to get a call. I'll be right back, I said, feigning frustration as I walked out of the basement and into the main part of the house. But instead of leaving, I positioned myself nearby, listening as they entered the sauna, their voices muffled but filled with an ease that made my skin crawl. Once they were inside, I quietly returned to the door and set my plan into motion. With a small push, I let a wooden panel I'd propped up fall, blocking the door securely from the outside. It wasn't locked, but with the heat in there, they'd start to feel trapped, desperate, soon enough. The muffled voices turned to banging as they realized they couldn't get the door open. Hey! My dad's voice called out. Hey, we're stuck in here! I stood there in silence, picturing the scene inside. Lisa, the woman who once claimed to love me, and my own father, desperate and panicked, trapped together with no one coming to help. I could imagine the heat rising, the discomfort turning to panic, the reality of their situation sinking in. After a while, I slipped the panel back, opening the door a crack. I heard Lisa gasp for air, her voice trembling as she called out my name. What happened? She asked, her voice filled with confusion and fear. I didn't answer, just gave them one last, cold look, and left the house. I drove to my ex-girlfriend's place that night, a woman named Sarah who had always been a stark contrast to Lisa. Sarah had been the quiet type, supportive, and I'd ended things amicably when I met Lisa, thinking Lisa was the one I was meant to be with. But now, I was grateful Sarah had stayed in touch. She greeted me with surprise, then sympathy as I told her what happened. She hugged me, and that's all it took for me to realize just how different she was from Lisa, how much better, in every way. I didn't stop at just seeking comfort. That night, I took a picture with Sarah in bed, both of us looking as happy and content as ever. Then I sent it to Lisa with a message. Here's to starting over with someone worth my time. When Lisa's response came back, all it said was, Why would you do this? I didn't bother replying. Instead, I sent her the video clip from the hidden camera in the shower, watching as the message showed as read but received no reply. Then I blocked her number, blocked my father's, and removed every trace of them from my life. That was the last time I saw or heard from either of them. I didn't care what they thought, or how they tried to justify their actions. My only regret was ever trusting them in the first place. I packed up a few things, picked up my mom from her sister's house, and drove to another city where we started fresh. In the days after I blocked Lisa and my father, I felt a strange sense of calm, a quiet after the storm, the kind that left a hollow sort of peace. Moving to a new city with my mom was like finally breathing fresh air after years of stale confinement. I'd found a small, comfortable apartment on the outskirts, surrounded by trees and away from prying eyes, a place where no one knew me or the disaster my life had become. My mom didn't ask questions, sensing it wasn't something I was ready to explain. We settled into a rhythm, and for a while, things felt almost normal again. I kept busy with work, staying late at the office and taking on new projects to keep my mind occupied. My mother, who'd once been so social, spent more time at home. She was processing her own pain, though she didn't know the full story. My dad's betrayal was more than she could bear, and I knew that when I finally told her the truth, it would be even worse. One evening, after about a month of silence, a message came through on my social media account. I'd forgotten I hadn't blocked Lisa on this platform, and there it was, a single, pleading message from her. It was short, no explanation, no excuses. Just 2 words. "I'm sorry." I stared at it for a long time, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Part of me wanted to unleash all the anger, all the pain I'd held back when I walked away. But another part, the rational part, reminded me that she wasn't worth it. She'd made her choices, and I'd already given her the message loud and clear. I deleted her message without responding, closed my account, and finally blocked her there as well. But the ghosts of betrayal are persistent. They stay, showing up in the quiet moments, tugging at memories you'd rather forget. The pictures I'd taken with Sarah, my ex, didn't feel satisfying anymore. Revenge had tasted sweet in the moment, but it had done little to heal the wounds. Every time I remembered Lisa's betrayal, a new layer of bitterness settled in. I wondered if she'd moved on, or if the shame of what she'd done had finally hit her. Then, one day, another message slipped through, a different platform this time, one I'd barely used since college. This one was from my father. "Son, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I need you to understand, it was a mistake. Please let me explain." I didn't reply. His words churned in my mind, though. What did he think he could possibly say that would make it better? He had been my father, the man who taught me values, who I had looked up to all my life. And now? He was nothing but a stranger, someone I couldn't even look at without feeling disgusted. After a few days, he tried again, sending a longer message filled with hollow excuses, half-hearted apologies, and pathetic attempts to shift the blame. That was when I decided I was done with the quiet revenge. They hadn't even felt the weight of what they'd done, hadn't faced the consequences of the destruction they'd caused. If they thought they could quietly slip back into my life with their flimsy apologies, they were dead wrong. I spent hours going through old files, pictures, and messages, anything that could serve as proof of their betrayal. There was no shortage of it. Between the camera footage, the screenshots of texts, and the uncomfortable family photos that now carried a sinister weight, I had everything I needed. My plan was simple but ruthless. I was going to make sure everyone they knew would see them for who they truly were. I compiled everything into a file, evidence that left no room for doubt, and sent it anonymously to several of their friends and family members. My mother's sister, who had always been suspicious of my dad's friendly personality, got it too. I didn't hold back. I sent them everything, even the video from the shower. I wanted them to see the betrayal firsthand, to see the lies that had been festering under the surface. Within days, the fallout began. I'd kept myself distanced from the situation, keeping to myself in my new city, but word traveled fast. My mom heard about it first, a distressed phone call from her sister. She didn't tell me everything, but from what I gathered, Lisa and my dad had become pariahs in our old community. My father's closest friends wouldn't speak to him. Lisa's family cut her off, refusing to take her calls. It was as if they'd both been erased from their own lives, left with no one to turn to and nowhere to hide. My mom finally asked me for the full story one evening over dinner. She had pieces of the puzzle, but she wanted to know everything. I knew it would hurt her, but I didn't hold back. I told her about the camera, the sauna, the messages I'd found, and the way they'd betrayed us both. She listened quietly, tears glistening in her eyes, but she didn't say a word until I finished. When I was done, she took a deep breath, and in a shaky voice she said, "Thank you for telling me the truth. I deserve to know." From then on, it was like a silent pact formed between us. We'd both been betrayed by the same man, and that betrayal had bonded us in a way that went beyond words. There was no need to talk about it further. The scars were there, visible and raw, but we'd faced them together. Months passed, and life settled into a new normal. My mom and I built a quiet life, free from the toxicity of the past. I started dating again, cautiously, taking things slow with someone who knew nothing about the disaster my last relationship had been. It felt strange, almost surreal, to open myself up to someone new, but it was also liberating. One day, while out on a walk, I received a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't pick up, but curiosity got the better of me. It was my father. His voice was strained, filled with desperation, and he barely sounded like himself. "Son," he said, his voice cracking, "please talk to me. I've lost everything. Your mom, you. I have no one. I don't know what to do." The words hung in the air, weighted with years of pain and regret. Part of me felt a sliver of pity, but it was smothered quickly by the memories of betrayal, of the lies he and Lisa had woven behind my back. I thought of the chaos they'd left in their wake, the way they'd tried to sneak back into my life with insincere apologies, and the way they'd shattered my trust, my family, and everything I thought I knew. I didn't answer him. I waited until his voice faded into silence, and then, without a word, I ended the call and blocked the number. That was the last time I ever heard from him. As I walked away, I felt lighter, like a weight had finally lifted. The scars would always be there, a part of me now, but I was done letting them hold me back. They'd lost me, and the life they thought they could ruin. I'd rebuilt myself, found peace with my mother by my side, and carved out a new future. As for Lisa and my father? They were nothing more than ghosts now, shadows of a past I'd left behind. Months passed, and life slowly settled into a routine that felt almost normal, like the remnants of my old life were finally fading. My mom and I kept ourselves in our quiet apartment, moving on in our own ways. She took up gardening and joined a book club, and I buried myself in work. The betrayal had left a scar, but time was helping. Slowly. Then, one evening, I got an email notification, a new message from an address I didn't recognize. My instinct was to ignore it, but something about the subject line caught my eye. It just said, "You deserve to know." I'd opened it cautiously, and there it was, a long, rambling message from Lisa. After months of silence, she'd somehow managed to find a way to reach me. She started with a string of apologies, words that felt hollow on the screen. She begged me to understand, saying she'd made a horrible mistake, that she didn't know why she'd let things with my father spiral the way they had. But what caught my attention wasn't her apologies. It was the strange, almost desperate way she described her current life. She painted a picture of misery, explaining how everyone she knew had turned against her. Her family wanted nothing to do with her, and our mutual friends had severed all ties. She mentioned that she'd lost her job, and that my father, who she had somehow thought would stand by her after everything, had abandoned her as well, leaving her alone and without a single person to turn to. She ended with a single plea. "Please, just let me explain. I need someone to hear me out. Please." I stared at the screen, her words filling me with a strange mix of satisfaction and pity. She was right where she belonged, alone, with no one to lean on. Part of me felt satisfied knowing she was finally facing the consequences of her actions. But a sliver of curiosity crept in. I wanted to know what she had to say, even if just to see how low she'd fallen. I knew it was a bad idea, but I replied anyway. I kept it short, saying, "Fine. Meet me at Hollow's Cafe on Tuesday, 6 p.m. When Tuesday came, I arrived early, finding a quiet corner where I could watch her walk in. I wanted to see her before she saw me, to gauge what kind of person she'd become since we'd last been face to face. When she finally walked in, I barely recognized her. Gone was the confident, radiant woman I'd once fallen in love with. She looked exhausted, her clothes hanging loosely on her frame, her face pale and worn. She spotted me and walked over, her gaze shifting nervously, as if expecting me to lash out. I kept my face impassive, giving her nothing to read. She sat down and stared at her hands, clearly searching for the right words. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what to say that will ever make this right, but I need you to understand that it wasn't what you think." I felt a surge of anger rise in me, but I kept it in check. "What exactly wasn't it, Lisa? Because I saw enough to know what it was." She winced, her fingers twisting together nervously. I mean, it wasn't like I planned it. It just happened." I raised an eyebrow, my expression hardening. "Things like this don't just happen, Lisa. You made a choice. Multiple choices, over and over." She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. I know. I made the worst mistake of my life. I ruined everything." She took a shaky breath, her voice cracking. "But I don't know. I was lost, I guess. I thought I could just, I don't know, escape the monotony, feel something different." Her words hit me like a slap. Here she was, trying to excuse her betrayal by blaming her boredom, as if that somehow made it understandable. But I didn't interrupt, letting her dig herself deeper. She continued, "And your dad, he was just there. He knew how to make me feel, I don't know, special, like I was someone else, someone exciting. And then, when I realized what I was doing, I felt trapped. I couldn't get out of it without hurting you, but I was too far in." Her words trailed off, and she looked at me, searching for a hint of sympathy. I felt none. "That's it?" I asked coldly. "That's your excuse? That you were bored, and he made you feel special?" She looked down, ashamed, nodding faintly. "I know it sounds awful, but I never stopped caring about you. I know I ruined it all, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know I'm sorry." I leaned back, studying her. "And where is he now? This man who made you feel so special? Where's my father in all of this?" Her expression shifted, a flash of anger crossing her face. He left me. He used me and left. I tried to reach out, but he won't even take my calls. He told me I was a mistake, that I wasn't worth the trouble. He blamed me for everything." I let out a bitter laugh. "So now that he's done with you, you come crawling back to me, hoping I'll, what? Feel sorry for you? Welcome you back with open arms?" She looked at me, desperation in her eyes. "No, I don't expect that. I don't have anyone left. I needed you to know how sorry I am. That I wish I could take it back. That I'd do anything to fix it." I shook my head, my voice firm. "There's no going back, Lisa. You destroyed everything we had. And now you're left with nothing, because that's exactly what you chose. You don't get to come to me, asking for sympathy after everything you did." She sobbed quietly, covering her face. "I know. I'm so alone." A part of me wanted to leave, to walk away and leave her with her misery. But something kept me rooted to the spot, watching her fall apart in front of me. I had loved this woman once, and now, seeing her like this, a broken shell of the person she'd been, only drove home how much had changed. Finally, I stood up, looking down at her one last time. "I can't give you what you're looking for, Lisa. You made your bed, and now you have to lie in it. Alone." Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving her behind. I didn't look back, didn't let myself feel anything more than a cold sense of finality. It was over, truly over. She had come to me, desperate for forgiveness, but all I had left for her was silence. As I walked away, I felt the weight of her betrayal lift just a little more. She was finally facing the consequences of her choices, and I didn't need to carry the burden of her actions any longer. She had lost me, lost everything that mattered, and now she was exactly where she belonged, alone. A few weeks after that last encounter with Lisa, I felt a strange sense of peace, as though finally severing that connection had closed a chapter of my life for good. There was no more wondering, no more looking back. She was gone, and I'd left her in the past where she belonged. Life started to feel normal again. One morning, as I was settling into my usual workday routine, I received an unexpected call from my mom's sister, Aunt Karen. She sounded concerned, asking if I'd heard from my father recently. I hadn't, and I didn't care to, but something in her voice made me pause. "He's been telling people strange things, you know?" she began hesitantly. "He's been saying he wants to see you, talk to you. That he's trying to make things right." I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my voice calm. "And what exactly does he want to make right, Karen?" She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. He admitted to the affair," she said, lowering her voice, as if saying it aloud would make it worse. "He's told a few of the family members, but he's making it sound like he's a victim. That it was a moment of weakness, that Lisa seduced him. He's acting like he's the one who was wrong." I let out a bitter laugh. "Of course he's playing the victim. I'd expect nothing less from him." She sighed. "I just thought you should know in case he tries to reach out to you again. It sounds like he's spinning his own version of the story, and a few people are buying it." The idea of my father twisting the narrative to paint himself as a victim made my blood boil. I thanked Karen for letting me know, but after I hung up, I couldn't shake the frustration. He betrayed me in the worst way possible, and now he was trying to rewrite history, trying to manipulate people into feeling sorry for him. It was like he couldn't handle the consequences of his actions and was grasping at straws to salvage what little reputation he had left. Over the next few days, I couldn't focus. My anger grew with every passing thought of him spreading lies, trying to justify what he'd done. I knew I shouldn't care. I'd already left him behind, and his life wasn't my concern anymore. But knowing he was out there, twisting the story, getting people to sympathize with him, I couldn't let it go. Finally, I decided I had to confront him. I had nothing left to lose, and I needed to put a stop to his lies once and for all. I texted him, saying, "We need to talk. Meet me at Mason Park tomorrow at 3 p.m. There was no response, but the next day, I went to the park anyway, figuring if he cared about fixing things as much as he claimed, he'd show up. He was already there when I arrived, pacing near a bench, looking older and wearier than I remembered. His once confident posture was slouched, and he looked haggard, as if the weight of his lies had finally caught up to him. When he saw me, he forced a smile, but I stayed stone-faced, unwilling to give him any sign of warmth. "Thanks for meeting me, son," he started, sounding tired. I know I don't deserve your time, but I wanted to explain." "Explain?" I said, my voice cold. "What's there to explain? You slept with my wife, lied to everyone, and now you're spreading more lies to save face. What could you possibly explain that I don't already know?" He looked down, his face crumpling in a mixture of shame and self-pity. "I made a terrible mistake," he said softly. "I was weak, I gave in to temptation, but I didn't mean for it to go so far." I scoffed, folding my arms. "So now it's her fault, right? You're the victim, and she's the seductress. That's the story you're telling people now?" He grimaced, nodding slightly. "Look, I know I sound like a coward. But it wasn't just me. She came on to me and I was in a vulnerable place. I didn't want to hurt you." "You didn't want to hurt me?" I interrupted, anger flaring in my chest. "You think I believe that? You chose yourself over everyone else, over Mom, over me. You could have stopped this at any moment, but you didn't. You kept going, and now you're trying to cover it up because you're too ashamed to own up to the truth." He stared at me, guilt evident in his eyes, but I could see he was still holding on to his excuses. Still refusing to accept full responsibility. "I know I was wrong," he said quietly. "I've lost everything, and I'm paying for it every day. But I can't stand the idea of you hating me forever. I want to make things right if I can." I shook my head, the anger giving way to a cold, numbing disappointment. "You can't make this right. You can't undo what you did, and you can't just pretend this was some moment of weakness. You lied, you betrayed us, and now you're living with the consequences. That's what you earned." He opened his mouth to respond, but I cut him off. "You want forgiveness? You want me to feel sorry for you? I can't do that. You're the one who destroyed our family, and there's no fixing that. All you can do now is live with what you did." His shoulders slumped, his face crumbling as he realized I wasn't going to budge. For the first time, he looked genuinely defeated, his pride shattered. There was nothing left for him to say. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving him sitting on that bench, a broken man. He had spent his whole life trying to charm people, to manipulate them into seeing him in a certain light, and now he was left with nothing but his own lies and a son who wanted nothing to do with him. As I left the park, I felt a sense of closure settling over me. Confronting him hadn't given me the satisfaction I'd imagined, but it had solidified one thing: he was no longer a part of my life. Whatever he chose to do from here was his burden to bear. I had my own life to live, and he no longer had a place in it. When I got back home, I told my mom about the meeting. She listened quietly, nodding as I recounted the conversation, her expression one of resignation. We both knew he was beyond redemption. She'd made her peace with it long ago, and now so had I. As I finished the story, she looked at me with a sad smile. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice steady. "For standing up to him, for not letting him manipulate you. It takes strength to walk away." In that moment, I realized that I didn't need revenge, didn't need to see him suffer any more than he already was. The weight of his own mistakes would be punishment enough. All I needed was to move on, to build a life free from his shadow. And so I did. I focused on my work, threw myself into hobbies I neglected, and slowly started to open myself up to new relationships. My mother and I supported each other, rebuilding a sense of family that didn't need him. Life went on, and over time, the wounds faded. My father became nothing more than a distant memory, a cautionary tale of betrayal and regret. I had my mother, my friends, and a new path ahead of me, one where I was finally free from the burdens of the past. After the confrontation with my father, a weight lifted. I'd said my piece, faced him without holding back, and walked away with no regrets. The months that followed were quieter, almost peaceful. My mother and I settled into our routines, each of us slowly letting go of the bitterness his betrayal had left behind. Then, one afternoon, while I was at work, I received an unexpected call from an unknown number. Reluctantly, I answered, and a woman's voice on the other end identified herself as someone from the county hospital. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully, before saying, "We have a patient here, a Mr. Richard Evans, who listed you as his next of kin." My stomach dropped as I processed her words. She went on, explaining that my father had been in an accident, a serious car crash that had left him unconscious. They weren't sure if he'd pull through, and he had no one else listed as his emergency contact. The weight of the news settled on me, a mixture of disbelief, anger, and a strange kind of pity. He'd betrayed and abandoned everyone who'd once cared about him, and now he lay in a hospital bed, completely alone. I debated whether to go, but ultimately, curiosity won out. I wanted to see him, to confront the man who had once been my father but had turned into someone I barely recognized. I left work early and drove to the hospital, my mind racing with questions, yet unsure of what I'd do when I saw him. When I arrived, the nurse led me to his room. The sight of him, frail and bandaged, lying still and pale, shook me more than I'd expected. He looked so different from the man I remembered, the once confident figure who dominated every room he entered. Now, he looked small, broken, his breathing shallow. The nurse informed me that he'd been unconscious since the accident, and that his prognosis was uncertain. I stood there, staring at him, a whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. There were so many things I'd wanted to say, so many things I'd wanted him to understand. But now, seeing him like this, I felt only a hollow kind of pity. He had burned every bridge, betrayed everyone who'd cared for him, and now he was alone, without even the dignity of facing his mistakes consciously. After a while, I sat down, unsure of why I was even there. Part of me wanted to walk out and leave him to the fate he'd chosen, yet something kept me rooted to the spot. I realized then that I wasn't there for him. I was there for myself, to close this final chapter of my life. As I sat beside his hospital bed, watching him struggle for each breath, memories started flooding back, moments from my childhood, days when I'd idolized him, trusted him completely. It was strange to think how much had changed. That trust, that admiration, they'd all been shattered. Now he was just a broken man lying in a hospital bed, the consequences of his actions finally catching up to him. The nurse came in a few times, checking his vitals, giving me updates. She mentioned he could wake up any time, or he might not wake at all. The doctors were unsure, given the severity of his injuries. I didn't know how I felt about that. Part of me wanted him to wake up, to see my face and know I'd been there, just to understand that he had lost everything and had no one left. And another part of me wanted him to stay unconscious, to let him slip away quietly, bearing the weight of his choices in silence. After a while, I realized I was just sitting there, expecting something, maybe closure, or some revelation that would change how I felt about him. But the longer I stayed, the more I understood that there was nothing left to say or do. The man who lay in that bed was already gone to me, in every way that mattered. He died to me the moment he betrayed our family, and no accident, no injury, could bring him back. I stood up, took one last look at him, and whispered, "Goodbye." There was no anger in my voice, just a finality. I turned and left the room, letting the weight of everything he'd done fall away with each step. The doors closed behind me, and with them, I felt the last remnants of my anger and pain finally slip away. As I walked out of the hospital, I knew that whatever happened to him was no longer my concern. I had my life to live, and he was nothing more than a chapter I'd finished. Leaving the hospital was like closing the final door on a dark, tangled chapter of my life. The strange peace I felt was real, solid, a relief I hadn't anticipated. I drove home in silence, not quite sure what to feel. But as the days went by, that peace began to settle, grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I stopped wondering about him, stopped replaying old memories or wishing things had turned out differently. Then, about a week later, I received a letter. It was from my father's lawyer, informing me that my dad had passed away in the hospital. He never regained consciousness, slipping away quietly in his sleep. The letter went on to explain that he'd left behind a few personal items and a handwritten note, his final message, to me, the lawyer said. I held the envelope, debating whether to even open it. A part of me didn't want to read a single word from him, but my curiosity got the better of me. Maybe it would give me the closure I thought I'd already found. I took a deep breath and opened the envelope, pulling out a single piece of lined paper with his familiar handwriting. The note was brief. "Son, I know I can never undo the damage I caused. I was selfish and weak, and in the end, it cost me everything. I hope someday you can find it in your heart to forgive me. Not for my sake, but for yours. Carrying hate will only hold you back. I'm sorry I wasn't the man you deserved. Dad." I put the letter down, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. There was a part of me that wanted to crumple it up, to throw it away and be done with it. But another part, a quieter, calmer part, felt the tiniest hint of release. This was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever get, and it was enough for me to finally let go. I didn't need to carry anger anymore. I'd rebuilt my life, one piece at a time, and I had everything I needed to move forward. In the weeks following my father's passing, life slowly began to settle. The note he'd left had stirred up emotions I hadn't expected, but it didn't reopen the wound. Instead, it gave me a strange sense of closure, a final seal on the pain he'd caused. My mom and I talked about him only once after I told her he'd passed. She'd been quiet, processing it, and finally she said, "Maybe it's best he's at peace now. And maybe it's best we are too." There was a truth in her words, and we left it at that. We'd both been through enough, and holding on to the past would only drag us back. Months passed, and in that time, I found myself changing in small ways. I stopped seeing every relationship as something that might turn toxic. I stopped questioning every person's intentions. Slowly, I learned to trust again, to let people in without that constant fear of betrayal. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. One evening I went through a box of old things I'd packed away, the remnants of my past with Lisa, memories of a life I'd moved on from. As I looked through photos and mementos, I didn't feel the anger or the sadness I once had. Instead, it felt like looking back on a story that had ended a long time ago. I closed the box, put it back in storage, and let it be a part of my history rather than my present. Years later, I met someone new, someone who brought a lightness to my life I hadn't known I needed. With her, there was no suspicion, no anxiety. Just trust, the kind I'd once believed was impossible to feel again. And that's when I knew that, after everything, I'd finally healed. In the end, my father and Lisa had faded into the background of my life, their actions nothing more than a painful lesson I'd survived. I didn't need revenge, nor did I need their apologies. I'd rebuilt myself, found happiness, and let go of the past on my own terms. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, hit like and leave a comment with your favorite part. We'd love to hear your perspective.